So here's the thing about humanity, his glorious acceptance into the Galactic Defense Corps. We were basically the participation trophy of interstellar civilizations. Picture this. After centuries of watching various alien species demonstrate their military prowess through complex tactical maneuvers and strategic brilliance, the galaxy decided to let the weird bipedal mammals from Sol 3 join the club. Not because we were particularly impressive, mind you, but because someone had to fill the quota for species most likely to accidentally start an intergalactic incident. Enter Cadet Jake Morrison, though everyone called him Muscles, because he once tried to bench press a hover tank and somehow succeeded. This was not a testament to his physical prowess, but rather to his complete inability to understand basic physics. Jake had the distinction of being the only human to pass basic training by failing so spectacularly at every test that his instructors assumed he was demonstrating some advanced form of reverse psychology warfare. His drill instructor, Sergeant Vextar, was a four-armed reptilian from the Saurian hegemony who had drawn what his species would call the shortest stick in the nest. Vextar had spent 43 years turning the galaxy's finest warriors into lean, mean, tactical thinking machines. Then humanity happened to him. "Morrison," Vextar would hiss through his translator, his forearms gesticulating in what I can only assume was the universal sign for "why did I choose this profession?" When I say left flank maneuver, I do not mean wander off to look at interesting rocks. "But Sergeant," Jake would inevitably reply, "those rocks were really interesting. Some of them were shiny." The Galactic Military Academy had established what they diplomatically called the Special Integration Program for species that required additional attention. In practice, this meant dumping all the problem children on one unfortunate training world and hoping natural selection would sort things out. Jake naturally thrived in this environment, like a particularly stubborn weed in a garden of carefully cultivated tactical genius. Which brings us to Predator Planet Kethmore, a charming little death world where the Galactic Defense Corps conducted their advanced survival training. The planet's marketing brochure, if it had one, would probably read something like, "Visit beautiful Kethmore where everything wants to eat you, and some things want to eat you twice for the pure artistic expression of it." The training exercise was simple in concept. Cadets would encounter the galaxy's most feared apex predators, assess the threat level, and execute a proper tactical retreat. This was considered advanced coursework because apparently, most species had enough survival instinct to run away from things that could turn them into component molecules. Humans, as we were rapidly discovering, had some gaps in their survival programming. The purpose of this exercise, Sergeant Vexistar explained to his mixed squad of alien cadets, his reptilian features showing what I can only describe as premature aging, is to teach you the sacred art of not dying stupidly. This is apparently a skill that requires formal instruction for some species. His four eyes focused on Jake, who was at that moment trying to figure out if his combat rations were edible or if he was supposed to plant them and wait for them to grow into something more appetizing. The mission briefing took place in what the Academy generously called a tactical instruction amphitheater, but which looked suspiciously like they had repurposed a cafeteria and stuck some holographic displays in it. Commander Zil Noth, a tall, elegant being whose species had mastered interstellar travel while humans were still figuring out fire, stood before a mixed group of alien cadets, attempting to explain the finer points of not becoming lunch. "Class, today we will practice the ancient military art of strategic withdrawal," Commander Zilnoth announced in that particular tone that suggested he had given this briefing many times and was increasingly concerned about the quality of galactic education. "This is not cowardice. This is tactical intelligence. When faced with a superior force, the wise warrior lives to fight another day." In the back row, Jake raised his hand. This was already a bad sign because Jake's questions had achieved legendary status at the Academy for their ability to derail even the most straightforward briefings. "Yes, Cadet Morrison," the commander said with the resignation of someone who had learned to expect the unexpected. "So when you say strategic withdrawal, do you mean like run really fast? Or is there some kind of alien dance involved? Because I've been working on this shuffle thing, and I think it might confuse predators." The other cadets in Jake's squad had learned to brace themselves for these moments. There was Blix, a Glorbonian whose species had the unfortunate evolutionary trait of sweating concentrated acid when nervous. He was currently creating small holes in his desk. Thorn, a crystalline being from the Quartz Confederation, maintained his species' traditional arrogance, despite the fact that his last tactical exercise had ended with him embedded 3 feet deep in a training dummy. And then there was Pip, a member of the diminutive Chirpin species, whose communication method involved high-pitched sounds that were technically classified as psychological warfare in 17 different star systems. Morrison, Commander Zilnoth said slowly, strategic withdrawal means you assess the threat, determine that discretion is the better part of valor, and remove yourself from the combat zone in an organized and efficient manner. So, running, Jake nodded sagely. Intelligent running, the commander corrected. Got it. Intelligent running. Is there a test on this? Sergeant Vextar made a sound that his translator rendered as a sigh, but which probably lost something in the translation from existential despair expressed in 4-part reptilian harmony. The mission parameters were elegantly simple. Each squad would be dropped into Kethmore's primary hunting ground, where they would inevitably encounter a shadow claw. Shadow claws were 12 feet of evolutionary perfection, designed specifically to turn other species into their constituent atoms. They had claws that could slice through starship hull plating, teeth that could bite through reinforced battle armor, and the unnerving ability to phase partially out of normal spacetime, making them effectively impossible to target with conventional weapons. The moment you encounter a shadow claw, Commander Zilnoth emphasized, highlighting the creature's specifications on the holographic display, you will execute Protocol 7, immediate tactical withdrawal to the designated extraction point. Question, Jake said, raising his hand again. What now, Morrison? What if the shadow claw looks friendly? The silence that followed this question was the kind that archaeologists would later discover preserved in geological strata, a perfect record of the moment when several advanced alien civilizations collectively questioned their life choices. Morrison, Sergeant Vexitar said carefully, shadow claws do not look friendly. They look like death incarnate with too many teeth. Yeah, but that's just like your opinion, man. Blix's acid sweating intensified to the point where he was now sitting in a puddle of dissolved furniture. Thorn's crystalline structure began developing what could charitably be called stress patterns. Pip's chirping reached frequencies that made nearby electronic equipment emit sympathy vibrations. Commander Zilnoth decided to wrap up the briefing before Jake could ask any more questions that challenged the fundamental assumptions of galactic civilization. The squads would be deployed at dawn to Kethmore's Sector 7, known locally as the place where good tactical decisions go to die. Remember, the commander concluded, the objective is not to engage the enemy. The objective is to demonstrate that you possess enough survival instinct to continue existing in the universe. Jake nodded thoughtfully. So it's like a really intense game of tag, but with more potential dismemberment. That, said Sergeant Vextar, is actually not the worst analogy you've made, Morrison. Kethmore at dawn looked like someone had taken every nightmare about hostile alien worlds and decided to make them into a theme park. The jungle stretched endlessly in every direction, filled with vegetation that seemed to writhe with malevolent intent, and the occasional sound that suggested large predators were discussing the breakfast menu. Sergeant Vextar had organized his squad into a textbook formation, Thorn taking point with his crystalline structure providing natural armor, Blix and Pip flanking for reconnaissance, and Jake, well, Jake was supposed to be in the center of the formation where he could cause the least amount of accidental chaos. This plan lasted approximately 47 seconds. Ooh, shiny, Jake said, veering off the designated path toward what appeared to be a cluster of iridescent crystals growing from a tree trunk. Morrison, Vextar hissed. Formation means staying in formation. But, Sergeant, it's really shiny. What if it's important? The crystals turned out to be some kind of local fungus that reacted to Jake's approach by releasing spores that made everything smell like vanilla and existential dread. This was actually an improvement over the usual Kethmore ambient fragrance of decomposing death with hints of sulfur. As Jake stood there waving his hands through the spore cloud and making what can only be described as pleased caveman noises, the rest of the squad tried to maintain some semblance of military discipline. Blix was sweating acid through his environmental suit, which was apparently not designed for this level of stress. Thorn had taken on the defensive posture his species used when they expected to be attacked by superior forces, which involved refracting light in patterns that were either intimidating or possibly disco-related. Pip was chirping in frequencies that suggested either extreme alarm or that he was trying to communicate with local electronics. That's when the Shadowclaw showed up. Military historians would later describe the encounter as a perfect example of how not everything goes according to plan, especially when humans are involved. The creature materialized from between dimensions exactly as described in the training manuals. 12 feet of biomechanical nightmare with too many joints in its limbs and claws that seemed to bend light around their edges. Every alien cadet executed perfect Protocol 7 tactical withdrawals. Thorn's crystalline form practically teleported backwards while maintaining defensive light patterns. Blix activated his species' natural camouflage ability and became effectively invisible, though the smell of acid suggested he was still dissolving things in his general vicinity. Pip's emergency retreat generated sonic booms that registered on seismic equipment 3 sectors away. Jake, however, stopped mid-spore sniff and tilted his head at the Shadowclaw with the expression of someone trying to solve a particularly interesting puzzle. The Shadowclaw, in turn, stopped mid-charge and tilted what might charitably be called its head in the opposite direction. For a moment that seemed to stretch across geological time periods, the most feared predator in the galaxy and the most tactically challenged human in the Defense Corps stared at each other in mutual bewilderment. "Huh," Jake said thoughtfully. "You're bigger than the pictures made you look." The Shadowclaw made a sound that the universal translator rendered as confused predator noises. Through his comm system, Sergeant Vextar was screaming retreat orders in what sounded like 17 different languages, some of which might have been extinct. The other cadets had reached their designated fallback positions and were presumably wondering why they could still hear Jake's voice instead of Jake's death screams. "Morrison," Vextar's voice crackled through the comm. "What part of tactical withdrawal involves staying in the same location as the apex predator?" "Well," Jake replied conversationally, apparently unaware that he was having this discussion while standing within easy dismemberment distance of galactic death incarnate. "It seems rude to just run away without saying hello first." What happened next would be studied in xenobiology classes for generations, assuming anyone survived to teach them. Jake, displaying the same scientific curiosity that had gotten him kicked out of 3 different educational institutions, began what could generously be called an interspecies communication attempt. He started by waving. Not a tactical hand signal or a gesture from any recognized first contact protocol, but the kind of enthusiastic wave usually reserved for greeting distant relatives at family reunions. The Shadowclaw's response was to phase partially out of normal space-time, which was either a defensive maneuver or the creature's equivalent of a confused blink. "Oh, that's neat," Jake said, apparently fascinated by the whole phasing thing. "Can you do that on command, or is it like hiccups?" Through the comm system, his squad mates could hear this conversation developing in real time. Blix had begun hyperventilating, which meant he was now dissolving significant portions of the jungle floor around his hiding spot. Thorn's crystal structure was generating stress fractures that created prismatic light displays visible from orbit. Pip's chirping had reached frequencies that were technically classified as weapons of mass destruction in civilized space. Sergeant Vextar had stopped shouting retreat orders and was now making sounds that the translator couldn't process, possibly because they represented concepts that didn't exist in any known language. Jake, meanwhile, had moved on to gestures. He pointed at himself and said, "Jake," then pointed at the Shadowclaw expectantly. The creature tilted its head further, which should have been anatomically impossible given the number of joints in its neck. "Strong silent type, huh?" Jake nodded approvingly. "I can respect that. My Uncle Bob was the same way, except he was strong and silent because he was usually unconscious." The Shadowclaw made another sound, this one closer to what the translator rendered as increasingly confused predator, attempting to process unprecedented social interaction. At this point, Jake made a decision that would forever change interspecies relations in the galaxy. He reached into his pack and pulled out one of his emergency ration bars. "You hungry, big guy? These taste like cardboard mixed with despair, but they're supposedly nutritious." He tossed the ration bar toward the Shadow Claw, which caught it with reflexes that defied physics and several conservation laws. The creature examined the package with what appeared to be genuine curiosity, turning it over in claws that could theoretically slice through the fabric of reality. "Yeah, you have to tear the wrapper," Jake explained helpfully. "Fair warning, though, the flavor is somewhere between artificial chicken and existential crisis." The Shadow Claw, following Jake's demonstration, carefully opened the package with precision that suggested either incredible dexterity or the ability to manipulate matter at the molecular level. What happened next would be recorded in the annals of galactic history as the day everything we knew about apex predators turned out to be incomplete. The Shadow Claw took what could charitably be called a bite of the ration bar, chewed thoughtfully, and made a sound that the translator rendered as surprised approval. "Right?" Jake grinned. "They're terrible, but they grow on you, like a fungal infection, but more nutritious." From his observation position, Sergeant Vextar watched his most problematic cadet engage in casual conversation with the galaxy's most feared predator, and experienced what his species would later classify as a complete philosophical breakdown. His worldview, carefully constructed over 4 decades of military service, was experiencing what could technically be called a total systems failure. The Shadow Claw, apparently having decided that Jake represented something entirely new in its experience, settled into what looked like a sitting position. This was noteworthy because sitting implied a level of comfort that suggested the creature was no longer considering Jake as a potential meal. "So," Jake continued, apparently unaware that he was revolutionizing xenobiology, "what do you do for fun around here besides the whole terrifying apex predator thing, I mean?" The situation, which had already transcended normal categories of military disaster, took another turn for the unprecedented when additional Shadow Claws began emerging from various dimensions. Apparently, word had gotten out in whatever communication network apex predators used that something interesting was happening in Sector 7. Jake looked around at the growing collection of 12-foot-tall biomechanical nightmares and nodded approvingly. "Oh, cool. You called your friends. This is like a party now." Through the comm system, Sergeant Vextar was experiencing what could only be described as a nervous breakdown in 4 different languages simultaneously. His tactical training, which had served him well through 43 years of military service, had not included protocols for what to do when your most problematic cadet accidentally hosts a social gathering for apex predators. "Morrison," Vexitar's voice crackled with what might have been hysteria, "please explain to me why you are not currently dead." "Well," Jake replied thoughtfully, sharing another ration bar with what appeared to be a smaller Shadow Claw. "I think they might be curious about humans, like when was the last time something didn't run away from them screaming?" This was actually a remarkably astute observation, though delivered with Jake's characteristic obliviousness to the profound implications of his words. The Shadow Claws, as it turned out, were displaying behaviors that hadn't been documented in centuries of galactic research. They were sitting. They were making sounds that weren't threatening. One of them was apparently attempting to open a ration package without using its reality-severing claws, which suggested a level of fine motor control that challenged everything xenobiologists thought they knew about the species. "Here, let me help you with that," Jake said to the struggling Shadow Claw, demonstrating the proper wrapper opening technique. "The trick is to find the little tab thing. Whoever designed these packages was clearly an engineer, which means they prioritized structural integrity over user accessibility." The Shadow Claw successfully opened the package and made what the translator rendered as pleased apex predator noises. Meanwhile, in their various hiding spots, Jake's squad mates were processing this information in their own species-specific ways. Blix had sweated so much acid that he had inadvertently created a small crater and was now sitting in what amounted to a self-made bunker. Thorn's stress fractures had evolved into complex geometric patterns that were either a sign of impending structural failure or possibly the most beautiful light show in the sector. Pip's chirping had reached frequencies that were causing local wildlife to either flee or gather, depending on their auditory preferences. "You know what this group needs?" Jake announced, apparently having appointed himself as social coordinator for this unprecedented interspecies gathering. "Games." He pulled out what appeared to be a deck of cards from his pack. Military-issued emergency entertainment, designed to maintain morale during extended deployments. "Anybody know how to play poker?" Jake asked the assembled Shadow Claws. "No? Okay, how about charades?" What followed was arguably the most surreal first contact protocol in galactic history. Jake, through a combination of gestures, sound effects, and what could charitably be called interpretive dance, began teaching apex predators party games. The Shadow Claws, creatures that had spent millions of years perfecting the art of being terrifying, turned out to be remarkably good at charades. Their ability to partially phase out of normal space-time made them excellent at acting out abstract concepts, though their interpretation of movies involved a lot more dismemberment than Jake was probably expecting. "Okay, that was either Casablanca or The Day the Galaxy Stood Still," Jake said, applauding what appeared to be a Shadow Claw's dramatic reenactment of something involving multiple dimensions and what might have been romance. "I'm going to say it was Casablanca because of the emotional depth in your performance." The Shadow Claw made pleased noises and settled back into the circle they had somehow formed around Jake. From orbit, emergency response teams were preparing for what they assumed would be a recovery mission to collect whatever remained of Sergeant Vextar's squad. The mission parameters had shifted from training exercise to potential diplomatic incident to complete revision of everything we thought we knew about apex predator behavior. Jake, oblivious to the broader implications of his impromptu social experiment, was now attempting to teach the Shadow Claws rock, paper, scissors, which was challenging given that their version of rock could theoretically destabilize molecular bonds. The rescue ship arrived 3 hours later to what Command would later describe in official reports as a situation requiring significant revision of standard operating procedures. Captain Rolthar of the GDC vessel, inevitable consequence, had prepared for the usual Kethmore extraction, collecting whatever pieces of the training squad could be identified through DNA analysis and filing the appropriate paperwork. Instead, his advanced scouts reported something that caused him to request immediate psychiatric evaluation for his entire reconnaissance team. "Captain," reported Lieutenant Fricks through the comm system, "you're going to want to see this." "Casualties?" Captain Rolthar asked, already mentally composing the incident report. "Sir, there are no casualties. Repeat, 0 casualties." "Are you certain? Check for disintegrated remains. Sometimes the Shadow Claws don't leave much behind." "Captain, the Shadow Claws are still here." There was a pause while Captain Rolthar processed this information. "Are they containing our people? Is this a hostage situation?" "Sir?" Lieutenant Fricks's voice carried the tone of someone who had given up trying to understand the universe. "Cadet Morrison appears to be judging some kind of talent competition." The rescue team found Jake sitting in a circle with 6 Shadow Claws, apparently providing commentary, as each apex predator demonstrated what appeared to be hunting techniques for entertainment value. One Shadow Claw had just finished a performance that involved phasing through multiple dimensions while doing something that might charitably be called a pirouette. "And that's why you get the gold star, buddy," Jake was saying, sticking what appeared to be a holographic commendation sticker onto the creature's crystalline carapace. "Points for technical difficulty, points for artistic interpretation, and bonus points for not accidentally opening a portal to the nightmare dimension." The Shadow Claw made pleased noises and settled back into the circle, where its fellow apex predators appeared to be applauding in whatever way beings without conventional appendages managed applause. Captain Rolthar stared at this scene for approximately 15 seconds before activating his emergency communication protocols. "Command, this is Captain Rolthar requesting immediate consultation with the Xenobiology Department, the Diplomatic Corps, and possibly a priest." "What's your status, Captain?" Command responded. "Sir, I believe Cadet Morrison has accidentally established diplomatic relations with the Shadow Claws." The silence that followed this statement was the kind that historians would later mark as the moment when galactic civilization realized it needed to completely restructure its approach to interspecies relations. Sergeant Vextar, when finally coaxed out of his stress-induced catatonic state, filed a report that became required reading at the Galactic Military Academy. His final recommendation read, "Suggest immediate transfer of Cadet Morrison to Diplomatic Relations Division. Also suggest hazard pay for anyone required to work with him." Jake, meanwhile, received a commendation for innovative first contact protocols and was immediately assigned to the newly created Department of Unconventional Diplomacy, a position that came with the official title of Senior Specialist in Interspecies Relations with Entities previously classified as universally hostile. The Shadow Claws, as it turned out, had been waiting centuries for someone to actually try talking to them, instead of running away screaming. They possessed a complex society, advanced philosophy, and apparently a deep appreciation for human party games and processed food products. And that's how humanity earned its place in the Galactic Defense Corps, not through superior technology, strategic brilliance, or military might, but by being too socially oblivious to follow basic survival instincts. Sometimes the most effective diplomatic tool is a complete lack of common sense and an emergency stash of terrible ration bars. The Galactic Defense Corps updated their training protocols to include a new course, Alternative Approaches to Threat Assessment, with special emphasis on the Jake Morrison method. The course description simply read, "Sometimes the best tactical decision is to ignore all tactical training and see what happens." Jake's success rate with universally hostile species currently stands at 100%, though Command has noted that this statistic may be influenced by his unique ability to be too friendly to kill.